we've been able to have a very good and quite lengthy discussion with Professor Ross Garnaut on the back of his recently released book, Dog Days. The discussion is in 3 parts, and what we're releasing is a trilogy. So you'll be able to watch all of them, or you could watch one and then watch another one later and another one again. The first part of the trilogy is really how Australia has managed various booms in the past, mining booms, wool booms, wheat price booms, and whether we've done a good job or bad job as a basis of learning the lessons of history. We need to learn those lessons of history because now we're grappling with the end of another boom, the China boom, from its rapid expansion. That's part 2 of the trilogy. What we need to do now to manage the transition out of the end of the China boom. Part 3 is a lot of new territory, and it's about the changing morality in Australian politics and the Australian community more generally, where Professor Garnaut talks about the less attention that is given by the media these days to public policy, looking for the 10-second grab in the 24-hour news cycle, where we talk about how business groups themselves and other groups are able to muster a lot of money to buy government policy through big advertising campaigns, and how indeed some business people are now able to buy their way into the parliament without reflecting adversely on them. It is a change. So these are the 3 parts of Emmo Forum, the trilogy with Professor Ross Garnaut, and I hope you enjoy part 1. Welcome to Emmo Forum. I'm joined by a distinguished economist and great Australian, Ross Garnaut, who's just written a book that really should be read by everyone called Dog Days. It talks about the period after the mining boom, but draws on the experience of Australia in handling various booms and busts over many years. And so we wanted to take this opportunity, Ross, to have a chat to you about Dog Days, about the future for the Australian economy, but also the final 1/3 of the book is a bit of a departure from your straight economic writings, where you do have some moral arguments that you put some parallels perhaps with Adam Smith, who wrote an economic treatise called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but another one which he started and finished beforehand, but kept writing and revising over his lifetime, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I saw some parallels that you're doing your Theory of Moral Sentiments after the very heavy hitting and hard work that you've done over many years. So welcome to Emmo Forum. I do urge you to have a look at this book. $19.95 recommended retail price, and that's at airport, so you might even get a discount if you buy it online. But do go to a small bookstore because we do want them to do well. So welcome, Ross.
Well, very nice to be here, Craig, and to talk to you on Emmo Forum.
Yeah.
And Australia needs more of this. Australia faces some pretty big problems, and the starting point has to be an awareness within the community. First, we've got a problem, and second, that there's some pretty hard thinking necessary to get out of our problem. So it's only by widespread discussion within those parts of the Australian community are prepared to look at things in the public interest, look at policy in the public interest, rather than just because they're pushing some sectoral barrow or some partisan political barrow. And that's the context in which I'm very glad to be here.
Well, thanks, Ross. The book really does talk about the post-China economic situation in Australia, or the post-boom situation. China's going to be there for a long time. But you draw upon the experience of Australia through various booms over the last 150 years, I think, even going back to the gold rushes, but the period of the very late 19th century and other booms, and you analyse how well we've handled the aftermath of those booms when inevitably they bust.
Yeah.
How have we done?
Well, it's a pretty sad story, really, and the saddest thing is that we don't easily learn the lessons of the past, so we do them again. I start with the big boom that Australia had from the gold rushes to the end of the 1880s. An extraordinary expansion, and it really created Australia. A period of great immigration, of economic development. The ideas that shaped federal Australia were formed in the last few decades of the century. And during the 1880s, at the end of the period of expansion, we were enjoying very high export prices. In those days, wool mattered more than anything else, or wool and gold, but wool prices were very high. It was a time of industrial expansion in Britain. And the London banks, and London was the world financial system in those days, just loved lending to Australia.
Couldn't get enough of us.
And we had 30 or 40 banks in Melbourne. It would have been something similar in Sydney, and quite a few in the other colonies. And we were a much smaller economy then. But all of these banks were borrowing flat out from Britain and lending for urban expansion, and we had quite a boom. In 1889, real estate prices in the area where I live in Melbourne reached a level in real terms that weren't approached again until 1989, 100 years later.
Yeah.
It was one heck of a boom. And then in 1891, the wool price collapsed in London. England went through the international financial system went through a bit of a crack, and that affected the international lending. It affected commodity prices. Wool prices fell a lot. When I was a kid, we used to all learn the Ballad of 1891, telling the story of the Great Shearers' Strike, and began the price of wool was falling in 1891. The men who owned the acres said something must be done. We'll break the Shearers' Union. We'll show where the masters still will pay the wage we give we want to, or we'll find the men who will. They'll take the pay we give them, or we'll find the men they will. So the price of wool fell. The capacity to support the high wages that had built up during the boom was no longer there. And at the same time, suddenly the credit from London to the banks dried up. So you had all of this lending to real estate. Melbourne was the centre of it, but it was happening in Sydney and Brisbane, other places as well. Just dried up, and unless you've got continued renewal of lending, a rollover of the debt, you get a collapse. And so the price of real estate collapsed, and so the debt became valueless. A majority of the banks in Australia failed, and we had huge unemployment. That was a terrible story. Big pressures for wages to fall, and the economic reality was we could no longer afford the living standards that we'd given ourselves during the Great Boom. We hadn't put anything aside. So it was a terrible experience, deep recession. In fact, for Victoria, which was then our biggest state, it was worse than the Great Depression.
Wow.
And unemployment.
And here's an irony out of that. You talked about this song about shearers and so on. The Australian Labor Party was formed out of a bursting boom.
That's right. And in a way, the formation of the Labor Party was a reaction against the adjustment. The adjustment. And
lower prices.
And in the minds of some people, the political role of Labor was to try to resist all these forces, but it wasn't the only idea in the system. Fortunately, it was mixed up with other ideas, and that mixture of ideas allowed the first federal Labor government to be more progressive.
Getting an education for kids was one of the basic aims of the early Labor people. But if we go forward, I mean, the Great Depression has been well and truly analysed. Can we fast forward into a short, sharp boom of the Korean War, and then a period of some booms in the early 70s and terrible slowdowns from the world oil price shocks?
Yeah, well, the Korean War boom's really interesting. Until this episode, until the China resources boom of the early 21st century, the highest terms of trade we ever had were during the Korean War. Didn't last that long, but for a while, our export prices were extraordinarily high.
And this is wool, wasn't it?
Wool was the big one.
Yeah.
The other prices were reasonably strong, lead and zinc, used in armaments. But wool, because a war in a cold country, suddenly the United States and other forces employed in Korea suddenly needed huge quantities of warm clothes. In that early post-war period, the Menzies government, which was formed in 49, had wisely kept on the economists that had been put together by the Chifley government, led by Nugget Coombs, who was head of what was then called the Commonwealth Bank, but it played a central banking function, and also very good economists trained in the new Keynesian doctrines from the 1930s.
The lessons of the 30s had been learned.
They had been learned and absorbed by the young public servants who came to work in the wartime government, the post-war government, and Menzies kept them on. And this was the first big challenge to the Menzies government, and it was handled well. It was the good response was based on advice from the economists, and they applied a basic Keynesian insight. Now, everyone associates Keynes with more expenditure in recession, but the other side of the coin was that Keynes said that when you have exceptionally good conditions, you don't let that raise your whole cost level. You save a lot more, and you need to run a big budget surplus when times are good. Well, that advice was given to Menzies and his treasurer Fadden, and they put in place in what's called the horror budget of 51 a series of measures that actually took out of the economy a lot of the increase in incomes. Now, because the big centre of the increased export prices was wool, it was mainly farm incomes that were going through the roof. And Fadden was a country party leader and treasurer, and he introduced a budget, one of the things of which was that farmers had to pay a number of years of income tax in advance. They had the cash to do it because of the very high export prices, and in effect they were forced to save. Now, they were a bit grumpy at the time, but when the price of wool came down, they effectively
they'd already paid
the next few years' tax, and so they got it all back. And taking that money out of the system, and they went further than that. They raised a number of taxes, they reduced expenditure, and so we had a brief downturn. Today we would probably call it a recession, although we don't actually know from the data of those days. We didn't have quarterly national accounts, but probably if we'd been able to measure it, would have been a brief, shallow recession. But it stopped the cost structure of Australia getting out of hand. We remained competitive, and that laid the basis for the prosperity of the rest of the 50s and the 60s. So that's a good story.
And that's as you say, over a very short period, but listening to what you're saying, maybe the lessons of that part of history should have been learned too. That is one episode where we have managed the boom well, that we haven't spent as if the boom was going to continue forever. So the next time we were faced with these circumstances was late in the Japan boom. Well, we're talking now about the China boom, the rapid industrial growth of China. But in the post-war period, the big story was Japan. Now, Japan had been a reasonably developed country in the 30s. It had to be, or wouldn't have been able to wage a war. But it was not at its peak, and then the Japanese economy was destroyed by the bombing of the war, and so you had a big reconstruction job. But by about the mid-50s, it was back to the income levels of the 30s, and then it kept growing very rapidly. And through the 60s, it became
industrial activity that used metals and energy intensively, and it was in some ways the equivalent of Japan going through the phase that China was going through earlier.
So they needed metallurgical coal for the blast furnaces, and they needed iron ore.
They needed iron ore, but also nickel and copper. And during that period of expansion, you had very high prices for a lot of these products. And that really laid the basis of a lot of our mining industry. They were the days when the iron ore export started.
So the infrastructure would have been put in place
for that. The very first projects in the Pilbara, in Queensland, you had the first opening up of the metallurgical coal in central Queensland. The nickel industry didn't exist before that, but you had mines open in Western Australia, and that really started in the mid 60s, kept getting stronger. And but because Japan's growth in demand for metals and energy was growing so strongly, the world market for a lot of these things started to tighten, and that created the opportunity for the Arabs to jack up the price of oil by restricting the export
through OPEC.
Now they did that in response to the Yom Kippur War, and sort of in reaction to the West supporting Israel in the war. So there was a political and ideological motive, but they wouldn't have been able to do it if it hadn't been a period of strong demand
for petroleum.
And so because some of our exports were substitutes for petroleum, like coal, then that gave a boost on top of all the other boosts. So in the early 70s, we went through another period of exceptional terms of trade.
That's another boom.
That's another boom. And high prosperity, high employment, and they were the circumstances in which the Whitlam government came to office.
So why didn't they stick with the McMahon government if they were presiding over such a marvellous economy?
Well, generally Australians stick by leaders who preside over prosperity, but there are some limits. And Billy McMahon went beyond those limits. Plus, Whitlam had an unusual appeal.
And he had a big social agenda as well.
And young people were excited by the international agenda as well. That was the later days when Australians were growing disillusioned with the Vietnam War, and we still had conscription. So there were all those reasons. And also the Australian community, the Australian electorate, has never wanted to reward leaders who've come to power over the back of other leaders.
And he'd knocked over
Gorton. And so he was off to a bad start.
And hadn't really established himself. But that was a pretty short period, wasn't it?
So Gorton had won the 69 election, where Whitlam had actually done quite well. But and then halfway through that next term, McMahon had become Prime Minister. But there wasn't any feeling in any part of the Australian political system that we were in exceptional times and had to be a bit cautious. And the Whitlam government came to power with the idea in its mind, in Goff's mind, because that was the mind that mattered. He was a dominant leader. That the main challenge facing Australia was how to share all this prosperity around more equitably.
Right. So the big social reforms.
Huge social reforms, a very detailed program. And Goff made a big thing of how he was going to keep every promise. And he'd made a lot of detailed promises. And he was committed to keep faith with the Australian electorate and deliver on every promise, and he did. There's never been a Prime Minister in Australian history who in more detail delivered everything that he
They called it
promised.
The program.
That's right, and if it was in the program, it happened. Now, as booms always do, this one came to an end.
Usually to an abrupt end. These booms in Australian economic history, do they bust or do they deflate?
Usually they bust,
Yeah.
and in '74 it busted. This last one's a bit different. It's deflating.
Deflating, yeah.
But '74 was one heck of a bust.
And that's the first oil shock?
Well, the oil shock came in '73, late '73, the Yom Kippur War, and that initially raised Australian export prices a bit.
Because of the value of coal.
Yes, but that wasn't our main export, but these were boom times for the price of grain, for the price of beef, for the price of metals, like copper and lead and zinc, products of Mount Isa and Broken Hill and Port Perry. What precipitated the fall in commodity prices was that there was a sudden loss of confidence in the international community in '74 and a pricking of the bubble in which the increase in oil prices was quite important.
Yeah.
The sudden increase in oil prices meant a lot of income was transferred from the developed countries to the oil exporters. That reduced incomes and expenditure in the developed countries. And so the United States...
And confidence went.
Yeah, United States...
You wouldn't know whether they're going to put the price up again.
That's right.
And they did.
United States, Europe, Japan all went into recession. This for Japan was a big change because they've been growing at 7 or 8% per annum.
So how did we handle this one?
Well, we hadn't put anything aside, and Gough Whitlam was delivering the program, and people liked that part of what he was doing, and the government was still in good shape for as long as the good times lasted. But in the September quarter, the falls in
of what year?
Of '74,
right?
The falls in commodity prices were starting to affect economic activity. And in those days, we had a fixed exchange rate. So the exchange rate had been jacked up a bit, but it was jacked up by officials, and they didn't bring it down straight away. So we went through a period where our industry was highly uncompetitive. Prices started to fall. With the fixed exchange rate, money supply fell with export prices. The balance of payments deteriorated, and that reduced the money supply. So that raised interest rates, the way the economy worked in those days. And we quickly went in late '74 to the highest unemployment we'd had since the '30s. Wow. And that was one heck of a shock for the community. Unemployment through '75, when the Whitlam government lost office, was around 5%. I have to go and check in detail, but around that level, which today doesn't sound that bad. No. But when you've had a couple of decades of 2% unemployment, and even in the recession of 1991, only about 3%, that was one heck of a shock. And I think that was the biggest factor in undermining electoral support for the Whitlam government. We hadn't put money aside, and so when international funds started drying up, and when commodity prices fell, there was no fallback. We just went deeply into recession.
And that period from, say, '74, right, there was a bit of a recovery, but then there was another recession in 1981 and '82 where unemployment and inflation, this is a neat trick, both exceeded 10%.
Yeah, well, from '74 to '83, we had a period of instability. Unemployment never recovered much, and we had a couple of dips in which it got worse, but then didn't get much better.
Yeah.
So you had nothing like a return to high employment during that period. You had high inflation right through.
Yes.
You had low investment and stagnation right through. Now, towards the end of the period, the oil exporting countries of the Middle East had another crack at putting the price up. Well, actually, this time it wasn't policy. You had the Iran-Iraq war, which knocked out of the international system a big hunk of supply from Iran and Iraq. The oil price went up again.
And that was what they called the second oil price.
And that was also a very big one. And the oil price went much higher than it had in real terms in '73. Well, again, we got a big boost from that. from
our coal.
From our coal.
And we were producing by then a pretty neat amount of crude oil as well, weren't we, out of Bass Strait?
Yes, we were almost self-sufficient, but we're still a net importer. But that
protected us too.
It protected the budget because Malcolm Fraser
took it all.
Took 100% of the increase in oil price.
That sounds like a pretty high rate of resource rent tax.
That sounds like a great big tax to me.
That's right.
But it meant that the budget of 81-82, the last budget until the economy fell into recession again, was roughly balanced, a small deficit. When, if it had not taxed the extra income from the higher prices from oil at 100%, the budget would have been about $70 billion in today's terms as a proportion of the economy. So there was a lot of anxiety in Australia about a tax increase on mining that took a few percent of the incremental income from higher prices in the things that eventually turned out to be implemented. Malcolm Fraser took 100%. I'd not say that wasn't good policy, but it certainly protected the budget. But the other thing that happened during that late 70s, early 80s resources boom, Japan had taken a decision in the late 70s, quite similar to the decision that China has taken recently, that it needed to change the structure of its economy. People were fed up with the pollution.
So they started exporting their big heavy industries,
through the 60s and beginning of the 70s, a lot of their growth was energy intensive, heavy industry, rapid growth of the steel industry, aluminium smelting, burning coal to generate electricity for aluminium. Well, they decided the community became well off enough to value a clean environment more than a bit more income.
You see the parallels with China right now.
It's a very similar story.
Close to the number one issue in China.
But that's how we got an aluminium industry.
Right.
If you go back to the mid-70s, Japan had the biggest aluminium production industry in the world, and we had no aluminium exports. Japan put a whole lot of regulatory controls on use on polluting industries, and that had its biggest effect on the coal-using industries. And that created incentives effectively to shift the aluminium industry of Japan offshore, mostly to Australia.
Of course, we had these big coal fields that could generate lots of electricity, and aluminium is basically alumina plus electricity.
That's right, and so we got new plants wherever we had coal fields.
The big power stations on the coal fields and put a big wire into the aluminium.
That's right. The Hunter Valley, Gladstone, and Portland. Well, Portland wasn't the right place. It wasn't on the coal field, but that was a marginal electorate so they ran a long wire from the Latrobe Valley to the coal field to Portland. And aluminium became a very big industry, but we had it because Japan began to focus on environmental amenity.
I understand. So then we came to the period that you call in the book the Reform Era.
Well, I think we better just finish that story.
Right.
No boom lasts forever, and this one didn't. So
this was kind of a short resources boom on aluminium
and coal.
Energy intensive
and
manufacturing.
And it was never strong enough to reduce unemployment to what we used to call low levels, but we got a bit of a boost in activity briefly, and during that period incomes rose, government expenditure rose.
Everybody's happy.
And then
go to the beach.
The same thing happened as always happens. Prices fall, becomes more difficult to get international funding for new projects, and so employment started to fall apart in the late 82, and by the time the Hawke government came to office in March 83, unemployment was 10.2%, which at that time was the highest since the Great Depression.
Yeah. By the way, 90-day bank bills hit 22.4%.
Yeah.
If you would have be astonished at interest rates at that time as well. But interest rates were actually regulated for home borrowers. So the Hawke government came in and there were lots and lots of regulations and impediments that would prevent Australia dealing with this boom-bust situation. Is that a reasonable summary?
Oh, well, it is, but the reforms, but we generally had a very tightly regulated economy. It was a financial system, but wherever you looked, the government was finely regulating business decisions. We've been talking about the resources. High tariff walls. We've been talking about the resources sector. A company couldn't enter a new contract for export without getting the approval of the Department of Trade.
Well, you and I just helped dismantle that because Lionel Bowen was the Trade Minister. I was working for Peter Walsh, you were working for Bob Hawke. Lionel didn't see the funny side of removing those export controls, but we did.
That's right, and every new contract, the main job of the marketing department of every company was to come and see us. They could sell the stuff if only
we let them. We want to sell all the stuff and make money for Australia.
So there wasn't. Don't
know about that.
So there wasn't time for them to actually deal with their final customers. It was a horrible system. But we got rid of that. But that's just one of 1,000 forms of regulation that were tying up the economy. Another one was crude oil allocation. All our crude oil production from Bass Strait and Barrow Island and a little bit from Queensland, South Queensland. Every company every oil refiner in Australia had to take a proportion of each oil field's oil, and the government set the price. Now,
that's right. We got rid of that too.
We got rid of that. But that's what allowed Malcolm Fraser to take 100% of the increase in revenue. He kept the price had been kept actually down low, even right through the crude oil allocations system had been introduced under the Gorton government, and Whitlam had kept it in place but kept the oil price very low. The Fraser government said, okay, we'll lift the oil price to international prices, but the government's going to take 100% of...
and that was sort of the beginning of so-called import parity pricing, wasn't it?
And from then on, through regulation, whenever the oil price moved with a bit of a lag, government would take another decision, say, well, this is now the price and this is the amount we'll take as tax. So we got rid of that, but replaced the crude oil levy with the resource rent tax,
which you taught me and got me into Peter Walsh's office, and we implemented.
And it's a much more efficient thing. The problem with wherever you have government fine regulation of business decisions, you get distortions of resource allocations. The distortion in relation to the crude oil levy was that not all crude oil has the same cost. If you've got opening up a great big basin in the middle of Bass Strait, probably only costs $1 or $2, or did in those days, to pump this stuff out.
Just a matter of
but once you got later in the life of the field, you had to put down a whole lot of new holes to get the last bits.
You pump stuff into it
and you have to develop smaller fields where the costs were much higher. And if you had a fixed levy, the crude oil levy, then you effectively took away all the incentives to take all the higher costs.
But when I started with the with Peter Walsh as Resources and Energy Minister, the companies didn't quite mind this because they'd go to the officials in the Department of Resources and Energy and say, look at our costs, these ones are can we tweak that a little bit? And they'd go off to lunch, and then by the evening they'd done enough tweaking, and Treasury quite liked it too, because every barrel of oil that came out, they just multiplied by the crude oil levy and stuck it in the budget. So there wasn't actually a lot of support, I must say, within the public service for the petroleum resource rent tax.
No, there wasn't, but they implemented it as good public servants once political leaders took the decision. And as a consequence of that, from then on, we had efficient development of the Bass Strait resource, and the resource rent tax take automatically varied as the cost increased, and that's allowed us to have a much longer life for Bass Strait than people in those days imagined.
And one more little anecdote. SO and BHP were given two options that we'd developed, and they took what we thought was the wrong option. There's a variance of the petroleum resource rent tax. We said, well, we did put it out for consultation. It was, okay, we'll go with your option. About 4 years later, they came back and I said, can we have yours? And we changed it to the one that we originally wanted.
Well, there are a lot of interesting corners of that, but there are other issues.
That's right. A couple of other quick regulations. Both airlines took off at the same time.
Yep.
There were
same price, exactly the same price, exactly the same time. Yeah.
So this tendency to duopoly reinforced by government regulation, saying, well, that's pretty comfortable. Hawke and then Keating broke that open by deregulating a lot. I remember housing interest rates were fixed at 13.5%. I don't think anyone would want to be paying 13.5% these days, but the government was everywhere, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Setting regulation.
Yeah, and it was a major drag on the economy, and it's one of the reasons why we had that continuing stagnation from 74 to 83. And I mentioned in the book, in Dog Days, I just give the figures on comparing the growth in that period, and especially the growth in employment with what happened in the 80s, and it's chalk and cheese, and getting rid of that regulation is an important part of the story. You only got we started collecting data. The Bureau of Statistics started collecting data on monthly hours worked per adult in 78. In the next 5 years, I think it was only about 2% in our increase in hours worked. In the equivalent period of the 80s, well, for the 7 years, so from 83 to the end of the decade, you can check it in the book, but I think it's 37% increase in employment.
Massive. Effectively, that's a good measure of employment because it's the number of hours worked per adult. So this helps deal with this problem of underemployment, where the official figures include someone who's worked for 1 or 2 hours a week. So this deregulation and reducing trade barriers, tariffs, they were 57.5% for cars, and then there were quantitative limits.
57.5% in the tariff, and then the quotas.
The quotas limited the number of cars you could import, and if you're outside the quota, you paid even more. So probably, I'm guessing, but maybe nearly prices of cars was twice as high as it needed to be, something like that.
Yeah, the Productivity Commission measured the effective rate of protection. I think for cars it was around 80%. So for the value that was added in Australia, you paid 80% more than if you imported the stuff.
So along comes a period of textbook economics, by and large, not perfect, but pretty good. And out of that, there's a big increase in a measure called productivity growth, something that Australia had struggled with for a very long time. What's that all about? Yeah,
I think we should just touch briefly on the recession that preceded
1991.
Yep. Because it's part of the reform period, and people like you and I, Craig, have to own up to it. Yep. It was a bad time. Mistakes were made. And the mistakes that were made have an awful lot in common with the mistakes in other booms. With financial deregulation, we had new players in the banking system, and bank credit expanded very rapidly. And this starts to look a bit like Australia in the 1880s. And so we had a real estate boom.
And it was a brave new world, as you say, because of this deregulation. Yeah. So were banks wondering how they were going to fare and got very aggressive in their lending?
I think so. I think the established Australian banks were nervous they'd lose market share and so lowered standards. And the regulatory authorities, and in those days it was the central bank because we didn't have an APRA then, the Reserve Bank wasn't quite sure how to measure monetary tightness in these new conditions. It was a brave new world. Yeah. In looking back, we can say things got out of hand, but they were having difficulty working in measuring monetary growth. So that's one technical reason. But also we had a bit of a terms of trade boom. We had a big fall in the middle of the decade, 85 and 86. Yeah. But then
that was the so-called Banana Republic time. And a lot of belt tightening went on then.
That's right, and the belt tightening continued, and we ran what by historical standards, was an unusually high budget surplus. Getting up towards 1.5% of GDP. But at the end of the decade, we started to get high commodity prices again. Wool price high, metals and energy prices were rising. They were boom time in Japan, again, not like the early days, but still pretty good, and Europe and North America. And we made the same mistake that we've made a lot of times. Too much credit was extended, and we spent the high export prices as it came in. And then 89, there was a big thump. You had political crisis in both Russia and China. Now, Russia took about 5% of our exports then, and China 5%. So nothing like China today, but still significant. And that lowered the price of beef, of wool, of a lot of our exports. And so that took the edge off the boom. And the Reserve Bank belatedly started to worry about inflation and started jacking up interest rates, but it did it too late. And so they were still tightening up and raising interest rates when the economy was heading down, partly because the export prices were starting to fall. And so we had this new big recession. It's the bad mark against the reform era, or economically the biggest.
And the government did it, but reading your book and earlier stuff, you're saying that all of the relevant advisors, namely the Treasury, probably the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the Reserve Bank, all had pretty much the same view that this is what should happen, but it was wrong.
Yeah, well, I'm very confident of that view because I was arguing against them. And it wasn't that I had any special insight, except that I was chairman of a bank in Western Australia. And I could see your businesses, which had been very sound businesses, were running into trouble. And so I talked to people in other banks about that, and I said, same story here. About you didn't have those messages going quickly to the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. So if we didn't have an independent Reserve Bank then, the Treasurer played a big role in setting interest rates. But as I say in Dog Days, even if we'd had an independent Reserve Bank, I doubt very much whether we would have got different decisions.
I understand. So this is the so-called recession we did or didn't have to have. After that recession in 1991, the so-called reform dividend started coming through in productivity growth, which is leading economist Paul Krugman said, isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And the best measure is something economists rather boringly call multi-factor productivity growth, but it's a measure of the productivity of both capital and labour. And that's the right measure for productivity. Looking at what you get, what output you get from all of the resources, capital and labour, that you put in. And on that measure, and let's call it total productivity, on that measure of total productivity, for 5 years in the 90s, we had distinctly the highest total productivity growth in the world, in the developed world. Now that's a big change for Australia because in the first 8 decades of our federation, we had just about the lowest. So on the back of that, we were able to expand employment, have moderate increases in incomes, moderate increases in government expenditure, all at the same time, and it was sustainable. So that's what I was about to say. This isn't a boom, although some people do call it a productivity boom, but it's different from a resources boom. This is something that's building over time, and you can then bank on it, if you like, in terms of improving living standards on the back of productivity growth.
And that's right, and that's why Krugman said what he did. He said, in the long run, productivity growth is almost everything.
Because you can have booms and busts and booms, but if you've got the productivity growing, that's the sustainable source of growth. That'll
stay there. We had that right through the 90s, falling away only in the last year or two of the century. And economists who've looked at these things and the Productivity Commission have associated this exceptional productivity performance in Australia with the booms, with the reforms, of the 1980s and 1990s.
But then things started to go sour again. This is not because of a mineral boom or bust, but productivity growth, and I have done a lot of work on this, started stagnating.
Yeah.
And I think it turned negative around 2004, this total productivity. Pretty much stayed there ever since.
Yeah, it started to turn down a lot at the end of the century. So those very high rates of productivity growth, 2.5% per annum in total effective productivity growth, well, that's very high.
Yeah.
That ended about 98, 99, and she was sliding from then on. And as you say, in about 2004, it went negative, and it stayed negative since then.
Yeah, but there have been some bright signs on the productivity front in the last year or so.